Thank you, everybody, for your patience. And I would like to welcome everybody to today's IT Leaders Panel discussion. We'll get started with the good stuff in just a moment, but first I'd like to go over some information. Some of the benefits that come with your annual subscription to it-leaders.org are live monthly web meetings, which I assume you know about because you're attending one. However, if you are ever unable to attend live, we do record and upload these for viewing whenever is convenient for you. Get to know the other members, log in to see profiles, and we're glad to make any introductions. If you are wrestling with key issues or decisions, we strongly encourage you to reach out to the other members. It's very easy to post questions, and our community of fellow professionals is always happy to help. After each meeting, we generate summaries with key takeaways and learning nuggets so you can easily reference them and put them into action. There are many other benefits, but I wanted to highlight just a few. If at any time you do have a question, please click anywhere on the slide and post it under comments. I'm going to open the forum for live questions at the end of the discussion, but this will allow you to ask them in real time. So now let's meet the people who are going to be discussing emerging technologies with us. Howard, let's start with you. Who are you?
Sure. My name's Howard Loos. I've been in records management for about 25 years, and I grew into privacy. I'm now the Chief Privacy Officer at Brigham Young University. I've been doing that for a few years now, but over the last 25 years, I have worked on teams where we dealt with privacy as well. I worked particularly with large Fortune 500 companies most of the time, and then it was time for me to go into the university area. Thanks.
Excellent. And Ted, who are you?
My name is Ted Neward, and I've been spending 50 years trying to figure that out. No. My background is actually in software development. I spent many years writing code, C++, on Windows and Linux. Did some Java for a while, did some .NET for a while. I've written a number of technical programming books, done a bunch of articles, and spoken at a bunch of conferences, all really around software development. Did some architecture consulting, and then about 5-6 years ago, decided to take that step into doing technical management. And currently I work as the Director of Technology Culture over at Quicken Loans, and leading a team essentially focused on the culture of a technology company.
Fantastic. Well, speaking about technology, let's get into it. So, artificial intelligence seems to be on the top of every emerging technology list out there. Do you agree or disagree, and why? Ted, you first.
Well, I mean, I think there's two questions I think that you're asking there. One is, is AI currently a big deal? And the answer is pretty reasonably yes, obviously so. You can't really turn around anywhere in the technology space without bumping into AI, machine learning, and its close cousin, data science. The other question, though, I think that you're asking is, should it be there? And truthfully, this is like the third cycle of AI. AI was really, really big in the 60s. Remember that's when 2001 Space Odyssey was made, and everybody was really, really amped at the idea that we were just going to have, computers mounted in the wall that we could just talk to like the HAL 9000, and they would be able to solve all these problems. And then we discovered there's a whole slew of problems with that. But we did discover that expert systems were, in fact, really, really useful. And then later we got into things, genetic algorithms, and, computers were going to be able to figure things out for us rather than having to create those specifications. And now it's all about machine learning. And I think what we're going to see is every time we've had one of these cycles, we learned something important and we gained some useful knowledge, but it never actually met all of the hype that it was intended to be. And I think we're discovering that now, that machine learning, the idea of being able to create these really effective algorithms by training models, I mean, really that's only as good as the data that you're being fed, which is where we're running into a lot of the problems that Amazon and Microsoft and Apple are discovering. And that it really is just another way to write an algorithm. I mean, at the end of the day, the machine, I would argue it's not learning anything. It's getting to a point of it's writing an algorithm that's better than a human could create as long as it's been trained correctly. And we're going to discover it's not the silver bullet, as we so frequently do in technology. It's not the silver bullet that everybody thought it was 5 years ago.
Fair enough. So, yes, but ongoing and TBD. Howard, what are your thoughts?
Yes, I think artificial intelligence is definitely an emerging technology. I agree with Ted that it's not the all-in-all. There are some practical uses for elements of it. I remember when, years back they said there was going to be the paperless office, and this was in the 1980s. And in similar ways with AI, it's going to take over everything that we do. There's some practical applications. For example, in my field, managing information, if we want to know if there's personal information out there, where it's located, and better manage it, we could use some machine learning capabilities. We could find contracts out there that aren't where they're supposed to be and get them moved to where they're supposed to be. There's information, for example, in the education world, certain things happen to students along the way before they fail in their courses. And if we could use small pieces of AI to keep track of certain trends in a student's activities and say, oh, a flag comes up because we think that this student is eligible or on his way to failing if he doesn't change something based on what other students have done. These are things that we could pick out if we had the human resources to track everyone. Of course, when you get into some of these areas, you have to think about the privacy of people's rights to control their own personal information. And in some cases, machine learning and AI can in some ways seem like they're infringing upon their personal rights. But as long as we're transparent and we provide good privacy notice of why we're collecting the information and that it's only used to improve employees or students or whoever they may be, and that it's not going to be shared or sold or any reasons that they don't know about, then we can stay within the lines of privacy law. I started off in technology, and then I got into the governance of information, and then now the privacy, which is not really a technology. It's more of a process of education and respecting the personal rights of people's information.
I like it. Okay, so yes, but not the be-all, end-all, and in addition, it brings up even more questions.
Yeah, and it can, it can help us automate a lot of things that we would normally do. We can build into a system to do what it takes us so much time to do and keep monitoring. Same less like credit. Your credit score. They can build more and more information, but sometimes they make the wrong choices too. So we have to have a right to correct things if it's starting to impact us in a negative way.
That makes sense.
Yeah, the privacy implications of AI are huge, right? I mean, I absolutely echo, and this is Howard's area of expertise. I've only dabbled in it, but even just looking at it from a software developer perspective, you know, what data you capture, where you store it, how you store it, to what purposes it's used. I think that there is a lot of cases here where, you know, one of my favorite movies ever is Jurassic Park, because it really does highlight the hubris of technologists, right? You know, the idea that they could run this park off of just, you know, a handful of people inside of the control room, blah, 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 blah. There's a lot of hubris there, and there's a lot of hubris in technology as a whole that says, oh yeah, we're going to gather all of this data about people, and we're going to put it in one place, and nobody will ever do anything bad with it. There's a really hefty amount of hubris there, and we need to make certain, to whatever degree technologists can, we need to make certain that data is used in useful ways, in non-threatening ways, and there needs to be accountability to it as well, which I think is where we get back to some of the legal implications of what we're talking about here. And AI is driven by data. That's why these two are so deeply intertwined right now, because, again, the data is used to train the algorithm. There is a tremendous amount of possibility here for people to go and do some really, really nasty things. And you know, the genie's already out of the bottle, but I really wish that we could kind of pull some of it back and say, let's think about this before we do it. Otherwise, T-Rex starts eating people, and I would prefer we not get there.
I love that example. It's also a pretty good segue, I think, into my next question. Is blockchain, since that has been suggested as a way to protect information, money, transactions, all that sort of stuff, do you think it's a realistic way forward, or do you think it's more a passing fad than anything else and some other solution is still out there? Let's go with Ted first.
So I'm going to annoy a whole bunch of people right off the bat, because I personally have almost zero love for blockchain. I really don't. I mean, it's a very, very inefficient distributed database, the end. And I understand a lot of the intent that blockchain is trying to go after in terms of being able to guarantee the accuracy of the data flowing backwards, you know, through the chain, et cetera, et cetera. The problem is, I think in many cases, the problems that blockchain are going after are extremely small and extremely specific in many respects. And I think we're looking at it as a tool designed to, in some cases, save developers from having to think about security concerns on a more broad scale. I think to a lot of people in the software industry, blockchain is kind of this magic bullet that will somehow save us from ourselves. I don't have to worry about data security. I can just dump it into a blockchain. And I remember 15 years ago, 20 years ago, when we started talking about the internet and we started talking about security, and we said, oh, just run everything over HTTPS. That will secure everything. And then we discovered Sql Injection Attacks, which, you know, I'm just going to put some SQL into an edit box, and yeah, that SQL attack will be encrypted from the moment it leaves my browser until all the way it hits your database, and it misses the point completely. You're not secure just because you're running on top of HTTPS. That's just one small tool in an otherwise, hopefully, wall of various tools that you use to make yourself secure. The other thing, very bluntly, is that blockchain is what's, you know, it's leading to a lot of this stuff around the cryptocurrencies. And right now, cryptocurrencies are literally what's killing the planet. All of the energy being devoted to Bitcoin mining and whatnot is just generating huge amounts, or consuming huge amounts of power, and all of the associated waste products that come with that. And, you know, I'm not sure to what end, other than so that a small number of people can try to get rich. I don't see, and I'm sure Howard is just salivating at all the ways that I'm wrong here, but I just don't see that there is a whole lot of purpose in the world for blockchain.
Howard, would you use blockchain?
I don't really disagree. I have seen some useful purposes, but I haven't seen where it can be utilized, as a whole at this point. That's not to say that it couldn't grow into it. It's kind of like, okay, cryptocurrency is using it now, but there could be other uses for it in the future. In my field, we've looked at blockchain as a possible way to keep records that cannot be altered. And there were some examples of people in some third world countries who had businesses and they owned things, and they had to basically they became refugees in another country, and they started over with nothing, and there was no documentation of anything that they owned, anything that they did, anything that they knew. And if there was some like global method to be able to capture what they had been doing, and so there was a test, could we apply blockchain to an environment where normally there are no abilities to show ownership or in the modern world, and there were some. It was kind of interesting, I have to admit, but I still haven't put my finger on how it could be used. My son the other day asked me, should I buy some Bitcoin? And I said, I don't know. You see it going up, but then as soon as he buys it, it'll start going down. I don't know. So I don't want to quite call it a fad, but I think we're still not sure as to how we're going to use that technology. That's kind of where I stand.
That makes sense. So it's got potential, but it has not yet reached that potential, is how I'm hearing y'all talk about it.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, it's. Go ahead, Howard. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, it could evolve into something, but at this point, I haven't found a use for it in my work.
Yeah, see, and I would have assumed that, given your work in terms of security and privacy and so forth, that's what I would have assumed to be the poster child for the use of blockchain. In a lot of respects, to me, this strikes me as technologists looking to solve societal problems using technology, which sometimes works, but also carries with it a fairly hefty number of assumptions. And that global infrastructure chain that Howard referred to, I mean, when you start talking about people who are refugees, how much access do they have to that global infrastructure chain? How much access would they have? I mean, I think there are some societal questions there, because in many respects, we have, historically, as a race, we have put procedural and physical security guarantees around records so that they could not be changed, which blockchain now tries to solve using technology. And we kind of have to figure out how blockchain would fit in with those procedural and physical access concerns. I mean, again, the case that I've always heard, land deeds and other sort of official documents. Yeah, that makes a certain amount of sense there, but then you also have to make sure that everybody has the same global infrastructure to make that work. And now we start talking about the county clerk's office out there in Kankakee County, Illinois, which for those of you who don't know is about 50 to 100 miles south of Chicago, out in the middle of farmland country. Are they going to have the necessary technology infrastructure to be able to access and make the necessary edits to a blockchain? I mean, infrastructure is not something that this country is doing well right now. Will every coal mining town be on a T1 so that they can be a participant in the blockchain? that's a societal issue, not a technological one. And so I think a lot of the success of blockchain would really depend on some of those societal answers before it'll depend on the technical ones.
Yeah, once we're connected, maybe there is a use for a global scenario.
Right.
But yeah, right. We're not ready for it. Just like, you know, back in the I don't want to say 1900s, but you know, late 1990s, there was talk about everything being accessible over the internet, and the technology infrastructure did not allow us to connect. And now we can, have SaaS solutions, but back then, it was, you know, there was an attempt because it was a great concept, but the technology didn't support the ability to actually make it practical.
And even to that point, there are still a shockingly large number of people in this country today who don't have reliable access to internet. And, you know, there are a number of charitable organizations that work to provide that internet access. And you know, 5G and wireless are certainly helping with that. But there's still, I mean, you know, can we say that all 350 million people in the United States have equal access to the internet? And I'm pretty certain that answer is no. And so until we address some of that foundational divide, I mean, hell, we've got towns in this country that can't even get access to clean drinking water, and we're trying to talk about equivalent internet access. There's some infrastructural concerns really here that I think we really need to get after before we can talk about how this is going to save the world.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah.
That's great. I hadn't thought about a lot of those questions. That does bring up a lot of new things. And kind of, again, leads to my next question. How will cloud computing affect the future of technology? And Howard, let's start with you.
Okay, so I don't actually, you know, decide, you know, what technology we're going to use in an organization. I try to provide governance on the choices. But what I've been seeing large organizations do is move more and more to the cloud, so that they have, you know, their need to have expertise in every single area can be lessened. You just can't keep up, and especially in the security world, a lot of smaller organizations, they cannot keep the security as efficient as possible in many cases. So if they use a cloud-based, you know, software where the security is already built in, you know, there's a lot of improvements. Some of the areas that I've seen as things to think about when you're moving into cloud, especially for the storage of all of your information, is that if you do have any litigation issues or government investigations, you know, what's it going to cost you to gain access to that information, and will that third party allow that information to be accessible without your permission? On the privacy area, if you're using a third party, you need to have good contracts that you know, ensure that personal information that's being stored on their systems is not going to be used for other purposes that you don't allow them to do. So there are some risks there, but no organization can do everything. So I believe cloud and SaaS I think it's here to stay. I think if we went back to where you had to have everything yourself, it'd be like going back into the dark ages. But I mean, it's not that many years ago, people wouldn't trust their information to be stored in the cloud. They were afraid of it. And now it's the exact opposite. If you keep it on-prem, it could be, hacked easier. It could be, physically confiscated or something, whether it's physical records, electronic records. So I've seen a total buy-in of moving to the cloud and to SaaS solutions. And with it, each area should have their own expertise that can improve your business. So you can focus on your business and not having to know everything. That's just my experience. There are some cases where everything is done in-house because of certain reasons. My organization itself, we used to do everything in-house. And we've gone from, developing it ourselves to using third parties. And now we've gone from storing it all ourselves to using, cloud storage options. So it's kind of my experience with that area.
Ted, what's your experience?
Before I took the step into pointy-haired boss land and management, I was an architectural consultant for a number of different places. And I will never forget working for doing some architectural review and consultation for a fairly large financial organization, not the one I currently work for. And I remember talking with their CTO and talking about the fact that for him to provision a new server in their data center was measured in months. And so in many respects, the move to cloud there was about being able to get at resources more effectively. And realistically, cloud is actually, really cloud is just, somebody else's hardware on somebody else's dirt, as opposed to your hardware on your dirt. Fundamentally, it's still a server. It's just not on your dirt, and it's not your hardware, so you're not responsible for the upkeep and maintenance of either. And the reason why cloud works is actually a very old economic principle that essentially says, there is economic gains to be had by doing things in larger quantities up to a point of diminishing returns. And so, Microsoft and Amazon and some of these other cloud providers can build, own, operate those servers, large racks of them, as opposed to your small mom and pop business who, if they wanted to stand up a web server, they have to buy the computer, they have to get the T1 line, they have to put the computer somewhere, right, probably in the manager's office of whatever shop they operate, and then they have to have somebody build the website, and they have to make sure if the website goes down, and that usually turns out to be like, the owner's brother's 13-year-old kid who's doing it when he's not doing homework. And, cloud enables us to do administration and maintenance and support without, and being able to amortize that cost across a large number of clients, that is to say the cloud consumers. It does carry with it its share of concerns, though, and Howard touched on a number of them. But one of the principal ones is it's no longer your hardware on your dirt. And so do you trust the cloud provider, for example, will in fact act with your best interests in mind? And usually we set up some kind of service level agreements to make certain that, you will provide response if the network switch goes down. The cloud provider will repair the switch within a certain period of time, et cetera, et cetera. But there was still a lot of hesitation in the early days around the security of the data. It's not my dirt and it's not my hardware, so technically my data is living in somebody else's home, and am I okay with that? And there are a number of companies, particularly the larger ones, who deal with very sensitive data, who really, really have to take that into account. And there are some legal concerns here too, because said financial company, for example, had some very, very tricky legal restrictions they had to deal with. For example, did you know that if you work with a company in Germany and you store financial data, any German corporate financial data must be stored within German borders? That's a law. And I'm not quite sure how that relates to the rest of the EU, but that is a law that they had to deal with. And many countries have similar kinds of laws, on top of which there are some companies who deal with sensitive data that do not want to store any data inside of U.S. borders, because the NSA has frequently asserted that it has the right to go in and examine servers within U.S. legal boundaries that the EU has offered greater protections against. And that can be a concern to some folks. I mean, you know, your company's relationship to the legal process is something that your company has to sort out, but the dirt that the hardware resides on is, in fact, an important part of the consideration, which is why, in some cases, many companies are moving to what I think will be ultimately the model we see, which is a hybrid model. I want 90% of my stuff to be living in the cloud for all the reasons that we have just talked about. But then the 10% of the stuff that I care about, you know, with a really, really high degree of concern along one particular axis, the cloud doesn't really give me good feeling about. That data I want to store in a NOC that's on my dirt, that is a server that I operate, that I can guard with, you know, ex-Marines and SEAL team members to make certain that people can't storm the data center and try to seize the hard drives or something like that. There are still going to be those areas where a company is going to selectively decide to own it and operate it because they can't get that SLA from the cloud company, or because it's on dirt that they need to make sure that they have a better legal relationship with, or whatever. And so, ironically, as much as the cloud was originally built as a tool for the big companies, it's really the smaller players that derive the biggest benefit. And this is part of the reason why startup community just went all in on the cloud from the very get-go, whereas a lot of your bigger companies were much slower to move and adopt it. And that's a good thing. That's actually a very positive thing, because it means it's a lot quicker to bring ideas to fruition if you don't have to build out your own data center. So, you know, I'm pretty certain that servers have been around for 50 years and will continue to be around for however, you know, until the heat death of the universe. And whether we call it the cloud, whether we call it grid, whether we call it servers, it'll be around. It's definitely going to be around. It's just what we sit on top of it may look a little different, because we're constantly abstracting things on top of these additional abstractions. So tomorrow we may, you know, the next generation is serverless, which is trying to abstract away even some of the programming platform that you work on. Let me just write a function and it will just execute somewhere. I think we're going to continue to see some of that abstraction level grow, but the fundamental underpinnings, servers sitting on dirt, not going anywhere. The idea of paying somebody to have it their server on their dirt, not going anywhere. Whether we call that cloud or something else, I don't know, but it's not going anywhere.
Fair enough.
Yeah. Just one other comment, which I fully agree with everything Ted has said. With Gdpr coming out in the EU a few years back, and you know other laws. I mean, it's not just Germany, for example. There are many laws out there. So there is a trend that cloud providers allow options so that if the information itself is created within a certain country, it can stay in that country. So you're going to see more and more of that developing to take that into consideration. But still, I personally have seen where, you know, you have the crown jewels of their information that just cannot be exposed for any reason. That I have not seen a trend where let's put that in the cloud because it's safer. I've seen, you know, where the Fort Knox model is going to, you know, be there and even in my organization, we talked about, certain highly confidential information. And I think you're going to see more and more tools out there that can sift through your information and identify what is highly confidential and make sure that it does, stay where it needs to be and it doesn't get leaked out there by accidental or intentional, purposes. So,
yeah,
great.
Yeah, total agreement.
All right. Well, final question. Howard, what do you see is coming down the pike as far as emerging technology goes? What should we be keeping an eye out for?
So, because I keep my nose to the grindstone in the privacy space, privacy is coming. I don't think there's any doubt about that. What we've seen in the EU is, and there's very good reasons why it started in the EU, because there was major misuse of people's information to harm them. But I see privacy as a growing regulations. It's going to be, it's more that, organizations can't just use people's information for the reasons that they want. They have to be transparent about why they want the information and why. I kind of to summarize what the Gdpr is trying to do and other privacy laws are trying to do. They're trying to get to where when you collect information, you have to be transparent about the purposes why you're going to use it. There's going to be more of a privacy by default model where when you display people's information or use it in proper methods, that you display the minimum possible instead of showing everything. So in the U.S., we've kind of gone into this opt-out model where, okay, we're going to do this, but if you don't like it, you can opt out of certain things. And you're going to see a transformation go on where it's going to be more of an opt-in. A person doesn't have to do anything to keep their privacy. But I don't see we're going to go to a point where we can't do our business unless your business is using people's information for improper purposes. We should only collect what we need from people, or when we need to request it through APIs or other areas. I see more use of data warehouses where there's governance on the information so that the organization just can't pull from the data warehouse. They have to have a business reason why they're going to use it, and that the privacy concerns and security concerns are baked into the model, where permissions have to be given for the use of confidential information. Sharing, you just can't sell people's information. You have to, if you're going to, you have to disclose it to the user before you could sell it or share it with others. And I see trends in where people have rights to know what information you have, and they have rights to say, I don't want you doing that. And one of the big items, this is something big in my field of records management and privacy, is that people have tended to keep everything forever. You build a system, it does an HR system or other kind of systems, and there's really no thought about, when are we going to get rid of this information? We're just going to keep storing it and storing it. And one of the trends I really see happening is because of privacy law, people, when the business value of that information is over, based on when you're transparent and you tell people we're collecting this information for these purposes and we're going to use it for this. When that's done, you just can't keep it because you want it, just because you have it. There's going to be a trend where you need to get rid of it when you no longer have a legitimate business need to keep it. And so you're going to see that. And another big trend I see, in at least in the United States, when we talk about personal identifiable information, we would think about social security numbers and, driver's license numbers and passport numbers and all that, and date of birth. And those were very specific pieces of information, and we would, take steps to make sure that those pieces of information were secure because there were specific laws that said we had to do it. But the trend that's coming is, I don't say trend like trendy. I think what's coming is privacy laws. It's more of a general privacy laws that basically will require us to protect and properly use any personal information. And the definition that the Gdpr in Europe uses is it's basically any information that can be used to identify a living natural person, meaning it's not companies and it's not persons who have passed on, it's living individuals. And the information that that we collect and maintain in our systems, we have to protect it. And there's really no way to segment out personal information anymore. It's not just the driver's license or the social security number. It's any personal information. And I believe, and I've been doing kind of a study of our systems, and there's not a system that doesn't contain some personal information. So the model is that you need to define, minimum security measures in your organization that all systems need to comply to. And so I see security teams having to do assessments and say, okay, are you meeting the minimum, security requirements? And then, of course, if there's social security numbers, that those minimum controls might have to be beefed up some, but you have to assume that there's personal information anywhere, and that could include just your full name, your email address, your direct phone number. That is personal information going forward. So to me, this is a major trend, and it's going to make IT departments have to shift a lot of how they think about how they manage and the websites where they're collecting information. They're going to have to be more transparent as to, what they're going to do with the information and, why they're collecting it. That's kind of what I see. And that's kind of why I moved into privacy, is because there's so much work that needs to be done in this space.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Lee actually had a follow-up question to that. California has said they only plan to prosecute 3 to 4 privacy cases per year. Do you think it is a sufficient deterrent for organizations to make change?
So I was in a meeting with, the European Commission. Some of their folks were here in Washington, D.C. at a privacy conference, and we asked that same question, who's going to be in your crosshairs, and should we be, stressing out over it? Should the, the people who sell the bus tickets in San Francisco be concerned if a person bought the bus ticket from the EU and now they're going to get sued for 2% of their gross income? And so they're their crosshairs are to deal with the misuse of information. Privacy laws are coming because people were collecting and using information in manners that were really, people felt like they were losing control of their information. So as long as you're making a good faith effort, I think you're not going to be in the crosshairs. As long as we collect student information and employee information, and we treat it responsibly to be able to provide an education to our, customers. And if we were off selling their information and using it improperly, we might get into the crosshairs. As far as the deterrent, the EU was starting off with some big cases. Some people think they were going to, target these big cases like Google, Facebook, Amazon, because they had money, and then they could pay for the next wave of people who were going to be used to find people. I think starting off small makes you think that, okay, I've got a few years before I need to worry about this. So to let that information out just takes away the urgency of complying. And CCPA is an example of laws that are growing in the country. You're going to see California is already working on modifying that so it's not just consumer protection, but it's all people's protection, which is going to be very similar to the GDPR. And the United States, the House of Representatives have been working on some privacy laws as well. I don't know, they've been kind of stagnating there, but at some point we're going to have a GDPR-like laws that we have to follow here. So our stance is, let's study the GDPR. Let's try to comply to the general principles that they're trying to teach, because we do respect privacy. And when laws hit that force us to have to comply, then we're at least partway down the road.
That
I hope
makes
that
sense.
answers that question.
All right, Ted, what do you think is coming next in technology? What should we keep an eye out for?
Oh boy, how much time have you got?
You've got 5 minutes. So give me first thing.
5 minutes. All right. So, fundamentally, again, coming from the software development perspective, fundamentally, the thing that I'm seeing right now is there is a ton of complexity involved whenever a software developer wants to produce a thing that goes out on the internet. There's been a lot of trend recently around the idea of microservices, and specifically the idea that a microservice would be a self-contained, isolated unit of functionality, sort of a vertical slice through the stack, if you will. And a team should be responsible for that vertical slice, right? This is where the Amazon 2-pizza rule, right? If you cannot feed your team with just 2 large pizzas, your team is too big and needs to be broken down. And that team should be responsible for its own, its software. It should be fully isolated, independent, blah, 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 blah. But when you actually sit down and start looking at what's involved in doing that kind of a full stack slice, you start running into a list of acronyms that are longer than your arm. There's a ton of complexity that's happening here. And quite honestly, every time we've hit sort of a plateau in terms of the amount of complexity to do something, usually what's happened is the industry has created something, some abstraction that sits on top of everything to slim down the complexity. Still there if you want to dive into it, but slim it down so that we can focus more on what the business needs done. So for example, when hardware was too complicated for people to keep track of all the different kinds of hardware that was out there, We invented operating systems to abstract away the hardware so you could write to the OS, and the OS would take care of interacting with the hardware, and that enabled a fairly substantial leapfrog. When we started talking about how users interact with the system and the command line got to be too difficult, graphical user interfaces became the rage. In the programming space, we were working with assembly language, and that got to be too complicated, so we created procedural languages, and then that got to be too complicated, so we created object-oriented languages. And right now, when you think about what it takes to put something up into one of those cloud services, you're trying to put something into a Docker image, you're trying to build the necessary database support. There are so many different files, so many different tools that get involved here. And this is part of the reason why so much of the recruiting space has become enamored with the term full stack. I want a developer who knows all that stuff so that I don't have to do the complicated part of trying to piece together a team that knows all that stuff from a disparate collection of people who know only parts of that stack. So there's so much complexity here that we are spending a ton of our complexity budget. Remember, the human brain can only keep a certain number of things in its head at once, right? The ubiquitous 5 plus or minus 2 rule. Anything beyond 7 and you just can't keep them all straight. We're way past that in the software development arena. And so somewhere, somebody is working on a thing to try to elevate the abstraction level of what we're working on so that I can actually spend more of my complexity budget focusing on the problems that the business, the client, whatever you want to call them, the people who are asking for this software want solved. I think cloud has something to do with this, right? You look at Salesforce, and what Salesforce has built is a model where you can focus more on the notion of CRM as opposed to the physicality of CRM. I have to stand up this server, I have to maintain these mailing lists, I have to build these forms, et cetera, et cetera. I think Salesforce gets that partially right. I think there's still a lot of complexity involved in working with Salesforce that we still want to find ways to reduce. But this is part of the reason why you're seeing so many of these verticals as a service. Salesforce is CRM as a service, and we're now seeing databases as a service. And as a matter of fact, I recently saw an article that somewhere in New York, somebody is offering Mom as a service. Like literally, if you get sick, you can go on a website and you can order like an elderly matron to come to your apartment and bring you chicken soup and tuck you in and read you bedtime stories and take care of you while you're sick. Mom as a service. We're going to that degree of verticality because we as IT departments want to reduce the levels of complexity that we have to deal with. And we need to do that in a more generalized fashion or potentially in a more industry-specific fashion. And I'm not entirely sure what that is. I have a few ideas, but it'll take longer than 5 minutes. So I'm going to wrap up there.
Fair enough. I think that gave us some high-level stuff, and we do still have a couple minutes left. So anybody, if you have a question for either Howard or Ted about any of the things we've discussed, or anything else, in fact, you can click anywhere on the slide and hit comment, or if you'd like to ask your question live, you can hit 5-star, and I will be able to unmute you. So again, click anywhere on the slide and ask, or if you'd like to ask it live, you can just hit 5-star. And it looks like we've already gotten to all the questions. So, final thoughts? Howard, you're up first. Anything?
I think that change is certain, and that the rate of change is increasing. So we're going to see more change every year than we've seen the year before that. So we do have to kind of more and more work within our own vertical space there's no way that I can work on privacy and be an expert developer at the same time. So, but back when I first started in IT, I built systems, I managed computers, I managed the network, I set up the email system. There was no hacking going on yet, and security was can you log onto your computer, and that was it. So things are changing, and it's just more and more. I think moving to the cloud in many areas is going to help us to be able to keep up with what's going on and what we need to do. Thanks.
Perfect. And Ted, final thoughts?
The one thought I would leave simply is what I had sort of mentioned earlier, that I think in many cases the technology space, we've reached a point where we are enamored with our own efforts, and I would like to exhort anybody in the technology space, instead of thinking about things like disruption and trying to change all the things that were there. There's this concept in the philosophy world called Lord Chesterton's fence, and essentially it talks about if you run across a fence in the middle of a field, before you tear it down, you might want to ask why this fence was built in the first place. I see a lot of people in the technology space talk about disrupting things. I mean, you look at Uber, you look at Airbnb and so forth, and in particular, they were created to try to get away from all of these regulations. And then, as we've discovered, in many cases, those regulations were there for a purpose, because they, in fact, ensured that the consumers of those services would be protected in particular, potentially scary cases. And in many cases, I think the technologists didn't stop to ask why the regulations were there and how would we deal with a situation that this regulation was intended to prevent. And I think we've done some harm to the society around us because we didn't stop to have those questions. So, this is partly where I think the focus that we have around STEM education and its sort of, overarching, we need to do STEM over some of the liberal arts, because that's where a lot of that background and some of those questions can come from. And I would encourage anybody who is in the IT space to spend a little time away from the IT space and focus on some of these other questions that technology can help but can't solve on its own. And if we do that, I think we will, a lot of the questions, that Howard brought up around privacy, I think fit very neatly into this category. Let's think about, how did we encourage privacy before there was computers, before there were these databases? How did we, what privacy did we have as individual citizens before computers? And how can we leverage technology to do good, but also let's do our best to not bring the bad along with it. So.
I love that. Let's make sure that what we've got works the way we want it to and the way it should before we keep going.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, I would like to thank everyone for being with us today, especially Ted and Howard. I really enjoyed this. I hope everyone else did as well. Don't forget to check out the website in a few days, and this conversation will be up. Hopefully, we will talk to you all next month. And again, thank you everybody for joining us, and thank you for your time. And Ted and Howard, I super duper appreciate you taking the time. And I will send you additional information about your subscription here in a few minutes. Thank you guys again. Have a good one. Bye-bye.